Well, we're looking at track plans again today. Actually, specifically one track plan. People have asked about the railroad quite a bit at Garage Mahal, which I call the Colorado and Utah. I've always called my garden railroad the Colorado and Utah. But let's look at the east end of this railroad in the indoor part. About half of the railroad's inside the building, about half of the railroad is outside, and this is the far part of the indoor part, the far east end, which is the end of the railroad because it's a point-to-point railroad. There's no continuous running here. You bring the trains inside and park them, and then can turn a locomotive around and then head back outside. And outside there will be a Y for turning, just the locomotive again, not an entire train. I've always realized that I enjoy building stuff much more than I enjoy running things. And if I've got a little section of track where I can run things back and forth, I'm perfectly happy doing that. I just like building the structures and the trains themselves, and I enjoy laying the track. But I don't spend all that much time just running the railroad. I find building it so much more enjoyable. And where these large-scale railroads take so much space, just turning a train around and going back in the other direction takes, in a loop, would take a 10-foot diameter of track to achieve that with the radiuses that I want to use. And well, that just eats up space way too fast. So the idea of having a point-to-point railroad where there's the ability to turn the locomotive around at either end is quite satisfactory. That's all I really need. So in looking at the east end here, of course my original vision for this was much more complicated and had a lot more going on, but then when you start realizing how much space that uses up, and keep in mind that this is about 20 feet wide and 25 feet long, so it's not small. It's just that the trains are so big that you just can't fit very much. Now, this is not finished at this point. It's not even all that close to finished. The turntable is not there. The roundhouse and tracks over here are not present yet. And most notably, the main line from this point over to this point is still missing. Just that little section. If that section were in, I could run all the way from the yard clear to the other end of the railroad outside at the west end. So this winter, I'm going to close this gap right here so we can drive trains all the way across the entire railroad. A couple of the structures are here. This is a full-size Rio Grande coaling tower, so it's actually quite huge in 20th scale. This is a somewhat compressed sand house here. And over here, this is actually a shoe shop. We did a show on that, Karen's Shoe Shop. The roundhouse over here is yet to be built, and this is actually a little lantern shop for the yard. Sort of a little yard office, but a lantern shop. And then down here, this is an ice house, and that is yet to be built. Now, as I say, the operations are rather limited here. One of the goals was to keep it small enough that every square inch of the railroad is easily accessible from the edge of the railroad, so you don't have to climb up on ladders or come up through holes in the bottom of the railroad to get to things. There's only two parts of this that are a little bit difficult to get to, and that's this little section of the main line right here and this little section of the main line right here. Everything else you can just reach across and it's right there. Those two spots require stepping up one level on a little step ladder to reach across. Still not that difficult to do. So it fulfills that goal we had of not having to crawl around and go duck unders or up ladders and reaching across. Everything is pretty much accessible. So let's take a look at how this was designed to function in terms of actual train operations, if you will. So a train arriving from the west end of the railroad will travel along the main line here, And along this very long yard lead, I think it's always important to have the longest possible yard lead, at least as long as the longest track in your yard, and then down the ladder track into the arrival track right here. Now that adds to complexity. The arrival track has to be open. You can't have anything parked there. At this point, the train is backed up so that the caboose can be cut off and placed here on the caboose track. The caboose track is actually long enough to hold either 2 long cabooses or a long caboose and 2 shorties. The train is now cut off of the caboose and pulled forward until it's clear of the switch, and then the locomotive is cut off from the other end, pulled forward into the track here, both of the switches thrown here for the crossover, and then the locomotive can run around the train back to the ladder track. At this point, the locomotive can be pulled forward back onto the other end of the train, and that can be pulled completely out onto the yard lead again and then shoved forward into the 3-track back here, the storage track. At this point, the locomotive can be cut off of the train, pulled forward down the yard lead to the main switch here for the turntable, and then pulled forward onto the turntable, spun around, and then backed into the roundhouse and put away for the night. Now, one gigantic disadvantage that you can see here is when I'm actually doing what you might call operations. It means that I can't have any cars parked on the 1 or 2 track in order to run around the train and switch it out. Moreover, I can't have very many cars back here on the 3 track, or there won't be any place to put the train once I pull it out of the arrival track. So in reality, what I do is I tend to just keep a lot of cars here on all 3 tracks, and it's just kind of a storage area. And locomotives can be backed down on there, grabbed a hold of a string of cars, and head for the other end of the railroad. Rarely would I do anything like actual operations, and since there's a giant gap in the main line over here and no turntable or roundhouse yet, I wouldn't be doing any of those operational things anyway. But as I was designing all of this, those were the considerations that I kept in mind if I want to do something like actual operations, and I did want to have an arriving train and switch that out in a somewhat prototypical way. This yard has that capability, mostly because of the runaround track with the crossover down here so that the locomotive can escape once it pulls into the yard. A very important feature to have. Now let's take a look at a couple of other considerations that I planned for as I was laying this out. The 1 track here is right along the edge of the railroad, and there's a shelf immediately below here where rolling stock is stored. So when I want to move rolling stock around, I can easily lift things off from the 1 track here, put them into the storage area, take something off the shelf, bring it up, and just set it here on the 1 track. So for just fiddling around and building up trains to mess around with, then that's one of the reasons why it's laid out the way it is. There's another feature over here at the roundhouse. 3 of the tracks are inside the roundhouse, and then the roundhouse has to be easily lifted off the railroad so that one can access the yard lead back here if something goes wrong, which of course it always does. But notice here that the track here closest to the edge is not inside the roundhouse. And so that again is sort of a fiddle track where I can bring a locomotive in there and lift it off, and the storage area there is immediately below the yard over there, that same storage area. So I can take the tender and the locomotive off and set them in storage and bring another locomotive up and set it on this track easily because it's not inside the roundhouse. So that's why this track is outdoors, is not inside the roundhouse. Also, that track is wired to a second circuit on the DCC so that it can be used as a program track. Because of its location relative to the turntable, it's not electrically connected to the rest of the railroad. so it can be switched between DCC and programming. So any locomotive set on here is isolated from the rest of the railroad when that switch on the DCC controller is thrown, and then a laptop can be tied into this, and the locomotive can be programmed from the laptop. Well, at any rate, that's how this yard and engine facility operates, how it was designed to work in a very specific way, to be a very small, highly efficient stub-end yard and very small engine shop. And as soon as I get the tracks connecting this over to the main line, it will be fun to pull trains out of here and take them all the way outside. Well, please consider clicking on the like button, and if you're not already a subscriber, please subscribe by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and Karen and I will see you here on Sunday. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.